I am your host, Josh Shepardson, and you can follow me on Twitter, where I post as @bchad50. And the first playing time situation I'm going to look at is that in the Miami backfield, where Lamar Miller continues to play at a high level. He's in no danger of being bypassed on the depth chart, and he's an RB2 by all measures and a strong one at that. But that doesn't mean that there hasn't been room for rookie Jay Ajayi to emerge as a strong rusher and a nice complement to him. Last week he ran for 48 yards on 6 carries, and on the year he's total 89 yards on 11 carries, looking good, running hard. He has 3 runs of 20-plus yards this year. To put that in comparison, Lamar Miller has just 4 runs of 20-plus yards this year. So this certainly is shaping up to be a very talented backfield for the Dolphins. And the reason I chose to highlight this backfield isn't to put Lamar Miller owners on alert or anything like that, but it is to suggest that it's worth picking up Ajayi. He is running hard, and should something happen to Miller, he does look like he is capable of turning in fantasy relevant performances if he's pushed into a bigger role in that backfield. And it's also possible that he carves out a big enough role to be an emergency flex option in deep leagues with the way he's running the ball currently, and with Dan Campbell's plans of running the football and playing hard-nosed football, as you'd expect a former blocking tight end to want to do. And the team's basically adopted his persona, and Ajayi's a hard runner who is playing at a very high level, has fresh legs since he spent most of the season on injured reserve with that designation to return, and he's showing that he has those fresh legs right now. Moving on to another AFC East backfield, we're going to look at the New England Patriots. LeGarrette Blount dominated the touches in that backfield with 19 carries. There were only 2 other carries from backs in that game, one for James White, one for Brandon Bolden. Was also targeted 2 times as a pass catcher. Did catch both of those targets. White and Bolden combined for 2 targets, 1 each, and James White was the only other back to catch a pass this week. But digging a little bit deeper, looking at the snap counts does raise a few concerns for Blount. He only played 38 snaps. James White actually played 28 snaps, so he only played 10 fewer snaps than Blount. And I would say that if you're a Blount owner, he's clearly the back to own in that backfield, but it doesn't mean that he is without some risk week to week. If game flow gets out of hand, it does look like Bill Belichick is comfortable having James White on the field. He is likely a better pass-catching back than Blount, and I'm basing that on the fact that Blount just is not a very good pass catcher. We have a track record of history that indicates that Blount's really not a weapon in the passing game, and the bar is very low for White to actually be a better pass catcher for them. So Blount remains a flex RB3, fringe RB2 when game flow looks like it's going to be favorable, but it's really tough to tell when game flow is going to be favorable for Blount, because Bill Belichick is not the type of coach who likes to do things conventionally. He isn't always willing to take the foot off the gas, which means that he isn't always willing to just give the ball to his back and milk away a lead. So Blount does carry some risk, but I mean, he's obviously the most rosterable back here. The only thing else worth pointing out is that White's probably worth a grab in leagues larger than 12 teams, and he's fringe ownable in 12-team leagues. Problem is if LeGarrette Blount were to suffer an injury, I don't see James White taking on a huge role in that offense. He's the most likely back to move into the top of the pecking order, but I think Bolden would have a role. They'd probably add another running back through free agency or through some other means. Jonas, for instance, speculation on my part, but Jonas Gray was cut by the Dolphins, so it would make sense for them to grab a guy like him who's familiar with the system should anything happen to Blount. So I wouldn't hold my breath with White as a great handcuff by any stretch, but because he is on the team, because he is the clear-cut number 2 running back there, he is worth owning in large leagues just based on that alone, and being tied to that vaunted New England offense that's led by Tom Brady, who's playing at basically, he's only had 1 season in which he's played better than he is this year, and it's actually pretty close between these numbers and the 2007 totals. The final running back situation we're going to look at is that of the Tennessee Titans, and basically I'm doing an about face since last week. Antonio Andrews, I was reluctant to buy into him as a lead rusher for the Titans, but after a couple of good weeks, I was reluctantly buying into him last week. I should have stuck to my guns as he carried the ball 11 times, total just 8 yards rushing in week 10 against the Panthers. And while the Panthers defense is great, they were semi-giving on the ground, so it wasn't quite the matchup that you might think when you just hear that he faced the Panthers. They are actually considerably better defending the pass than the run. Andrews played 25 snaps. Dexter McCluster played 18. Bishop Sankey played 3. Bishop Sankey's time being active for games probably coming to a close. He is buried in that pecking order. And David Cobb, who was active, added to the active roster before the Week 10 game, was not on the active roster for that contest, but he is expected to be active for Thursday's game against the Jacksonville Jaguars. Obviously not racing to stick him into your lineups right yet, but he is worth rostering since Andrews looks like a fairly passable back for that top back honor in Tennessee. And Cobb was drafted high enough that you can expect that they'll be willing to give him a look if he looks good in practice and if he shows some flashes in the game. He is a hard runner. He's a guy who can get some goal line touches, and he at least has some upside. And with the state of running back, what it is right now, it's worth grabbing a guy like him and speculating on him possibly having an increased role here down the stretch. Moving on to the pass catchers, we're going to look at the Arizona Cardinals where, Larry Fitzgerald is pretty much universally owned. He's been great this year. There's not much for me to say about him. John Brown, also widely owned, but laid an egg for his owners this past week. Was targeted 3 times, posted 0 catches, 0 receiving yards, and 0 touchdowns, which means 0 fantasy points from him this past week. But it's not time to push the panic button and cut him just yet. He's had a good year, and Carson Palmer is absolutely locked this season. But I do want to point out how good Michael Floyd has been. Played 62 offensive snaps, was targeted 9 times, reeled in 7 receptions for 113 yards and 2 touchdowns against the Legion of Boom secondary. He's been great, back-to-back 100-plus yard receiving games, and 4th straight game of reaching the end zone. He's totaled 50 or more receiving yards in each of those 4 games, and he is under-owned across the industry. 78% ownership at CBS, 60.6% ownership at ESPN, and 62% ownership at Yahoo. He is playing at a high level, and even with Fitzgerald ahead of him in the pecking order and John Brown playing at a high level most of the year, and someone who's going to threaten him for touches, Floyd needs to be owned across the board. He's certainly capable of having a bad game because there are so many mouths to feed, and he is dealing with a hamstring injury right now, but it's considered day-to-day. If he suits up, then he's playable against the Bengals, and the fact that he's playing at such a high level and Carson Palmer is playing at such a high level gives him a pretty high ceiling, even with the other options there in Arizona. So if he is available on your waiver wire, go ahead and go out and grab him. Moving on to the Baltimore Ravens, we finally got to look at the post-Steve Smith Sr. Passing attack with Smith out for the year. Predictably, Kamar Aiken ended up leading the team in targets, receptions, receiving yards. He was expected to be the #1 option for Joe Flacco, and he was just that. Targeted 14 times, was inefficient, reeling in just 7 of those, but did total 73 yards, so that is a viable fantasy line. And he doesn't have to be efficient if he's going to continue to be targeted on double-digit volume. And I think that is probably going to be the case the rest of the year, making him a matchup play as a flex or a wide receiver 3. When the matchup's right, Aiken is usable. Chris Gibbons is the other starting receiver there. Caught a touchdown, had 4 receptions for 37 yards on 7 targets. Not really a consistent receiving threat, but he does have deep speed, so there is some Hail Mary appeal to him if you absolutely have to stick someone in. Is capable of getting behind a secondary and reeling in some long passes, but I wouldn't count on anything even close to consistent play from him. But with a guy like that, certainly worth rostering in a 14-team league or even larger, crazier leagues than that. And then Crockett Gilmore is the other guy that I wanted to highlight here. He was on the field for 46 offensive snaps, caught all four of his targets for 42 yards and a touchdown. His game against the Raiders early in the year does look like an outlier, but he has caught touchdowns in back-to-back games. There is an opportunity for him to emerge as a bigger more integral part in this offense. If you're desperate at tight end in a 12-team league or larger, it's worth speculating on Crockett Gilmore with a bench spot. I wouldn't immediately go stick him in there. He does have an okay matchup this week if you do absolutely need a tight end, facing a middle of the Pack Rams defense defending tight ends. And if his role does continue to increase or he maintains his role that he demonstrated this past week, he'll have some fringe starting value in fantasy leagues going forward. Next up, we're going to look at another AFC North team, and that's the Cleveland Browns. Travis Benjamin led the way in targets, tied for the lead in receptions, and led the way in receiving yards with 11 targets, 7 receptions, and 113 receiving yards in Week 10. The reason that I chose to highlight this passing situation is because Johnny Manziel was the starter for that game, and Johnny Manziel has been named the starter for the remainder of the year. It's good to see the top receiver and the only really ownable fantasy receiver continuing to get looks and touches with Johnny Manziel under center. So no need to go ahead and cut bait with him or run and hide just yet. But certainly if you can move him, get away from relying on the inconsistent Johnny Manziel, I would advise that. More importantly, though, I would move Gary Barnidge at this point. Barnidge did turn in a good game, so he does keep the dealing window open for him. 8 targets resulted in 6 receptions for 65 yards and the Browns' only touchdown of the game. But Barnidge clearly was locked in with Josh McCown, and Josh McCown no longer the starter. It isn't a given that Johnny Manziel is going to continue to play at the level that he did in the loss of the Steelers this past week. And it's not a given that he's going to continue to target Barnidge the way that he did. So I would cash out on Barnidge at this point. His value can't really get higher than it is right now. So if you can move him, one guy that I would consider moving him for is a guy that I highlighted in Buy Low, Sell High last week, and that is tight end Julius Thomas. Not strictly in a one-for-one. Barnidge has outperformed him this year, and you'd be doing yourself a disservice to sell him in a one-for-one like that. But Thomas does have a favorable schedule going forward, and moving him in a deal where you can pick up another player, a 2-for-2, where you're upgrading someplace else certainly makes a lot of sense to me. Final playing time situation we're going to look at is that of the Green Bay playing time and usage situation we're going to look at is that of the Green Bay Packers. Devontae Adams was targeted a staggering 21 times, played more offensive snaps than any other receiver with 87, but he caught only 10 of the 21 targets, totaled only 79 yards receiving, and failed to reach the end zone again. As long as the volume remains high, which it looks like it's going to, Adams has decent value in PPR leagues, could be a strong wide receiver 3 there, but his lack of touchdowns is a bit alarming, caps his ceiling. The fact that he's not tallying many yards per reception isn't exactly exciting either, but he's been targeted a ton lately. 31 targets over the last 2 weeks, 17 receptions for 172 yards receiving. Certainly very good numbers. But again, the lack of touchdowns does limit his ceiling. In standard scoring formats, more of a flex for me, but certainly usable flex, again, as long as he's going to continue to get these targets. James Jones on the field for 86 offensive snaps, targeted just 2 times, 0 receptions, 0 receiving yards. He is 100% touchdown dependent for value and boom or bust every week. So certainly worth rostering because any receiver that's got touchdown upside playing with Aaron Rodgers certainly makes sense to roster. But if you're in a shallow league, I mean, you can cut bait. But if you're in a 12-team league or larger, Jones is what he is at this point. His hot start is a bit of a distant memory, and he's back to being the touchdown or bust player that he was really in his first go-around with the Packers and looking like is again in this go-around with them. And Randall Cobb played 82 offensive snaps, was targeted 10 times, 5 receptions for 53 yards receiving. Pretty much par for the course for the year. Cobb's a fantasy starter, certainly, but not really taking well to the expanded role in the absence of Jordy Nelson. Really seems to need Nelson to take some of the pressure off of him. And he's playing like a fringy wide receiver, too. He's not even on pace to break 1,000 yards receiving this year, so more of a good option than a great one. But at this point, you're certainly not looking to cash out. His value really isn't extremely high at this point, so That's where the passing situation is for the Packers, and that's going to wrap things up. Check out fantasyfootballcafe.com for our podcasts and articles, as well as our very active fantasy football forums with some very enthusiastic fantasy football gamers, fans, and get on there and get some great advice and get yourself to your fantasy playoffs and maybe winning your league perhaps. Till next week, good luck.